Tonight's story takes us back to London in the year 1888, to a part of the city that was crowded, restless, and filled with the rhythms of late 19th century life. The district of Whitechapel lay in the East End, an area shaped by poverty, migration, and constant movement. Streets were narrow, lighting was limited, and the boundaries between private and public life were often blurred. It was here, within this dense urban environment, that a series of violent crimes occurred that would later become known around the world under a single name. What made these events particularly difficult for investigators was not only the severity of the crimes themselves, but the conditions in which they occurred. Policing methods were still developing, forensic science was limited, and communication systems lacked the speed and coordination that modern investigators rely upon. Authorities were required to reconstruct events using witness testimony, physical observation, and local knowledge, often under intense public pressure. Over time, the case became more than an investigation. It became part of history, shaped by newspapers, rumors, and later interpretations. Yet beneath the layers of speculation lies a real investigative effort carried out by police officers working within the tools and knowledge available to them at the time. Their records, reports, and decisions form the foundation of what is still known today. As you settle in, allow the pace of this story to unfold slowly. There is no need to search for dramatic conclusions. Instead, we will follow the historical record, the confirmed timeline, and the institutional response to a series of crimes that challenged authorities more than a century ago, and which continue to remain unresolved within the memory of London itself. In the late 19th century, London was the largest city in the world, a centre of industry, trade, and population growth. Beneath its wealth and global influence, however, existed areas of deep poverty and overcrowding. Whitechapel, located in the East End, was one of the districts most affected by these conditions. The neighbourhood had grown rapidly as people migrated to the city in search of work, leading to housing shortages, unstable employment, and difficult living circumstances for many residents. Buildings in Whitechapel were often divided into multiple rented rooms, sometimes housing entire families within a single space. Lodging houses provided temporary shelter for individuals who could afford only a nightly fee, meaning that residents frequently moved between locations. This constant turnover created an environment where neighbors might not know one another well, and where tracking individual movements could be difficult for authorities. Street lighting was limited compared with modern standards. Gas lamps provided some illumination, but many areas remained shadowed after dark. Narrow alleys, courtyards, and passageways created spaces where visibility was reduced, especially during late hours. For investigators, these physical conditions made observation and patrol more challenging, as crimes could occur without witnesses noticing immediately. Economic instability also shaped daily life. Employment opportunities often depended on casual labor, with workers hired for short periods rather than long-term positions. When jobs were unavailable, individuals faced immediate financial hardship. This uncertainty contributed to high levels of stress and vulnerability within the community. Social support systems existed, but were frequently overwhelmed by the scale of need. Whitechapel was also culturally diverse. Immigrant communities, including many from Eastern Europe, had settled in the area, bringing languages and customs that sometimes differed from those of established residents. While this diversity enriched the neighborhood, it also created communication barriers during police investigations. Witnesses might hesitate to speak with authorities due to language differences or mistrust of institutions, complicating efforts to gather information. For women living in poverty during this period, opportunities for stable employment were limited. Some relied on informal work or unstable arrangements to survive financially. These social realities placed certain individuals at greater risk, particularly during nighttime hours when streets were less populated and support networks were harder to access. Investigators later recognized that environmental vulnerability played a role in how crimes could occur without immediate intervention. Public health conditions added another layer of difficulty. Sanitation infrastructure was still developing, and overcrowded housing increased the spread of illness. Medical services were not always accessible to those without financial resources. This broader environment of hardship influenced both daily routines and the ability of authorities to respond effectively when incidents occurred. Policing in such an area required balancing visibility with practicality. Officers patrolled on foot, covering assigned beats through regular movement rather than stationed surveillance. While this approach provided some deterrence, it also meant that large portions of neighborhood streets could remain temporarily unobserved between patrol passes. In densely populated districts like Whitechapel, these gaps were unavoidable. The social and physical environment of Victorian Whitechapel therefore formed an important backdrop for the investigation that would follow. The combination of overcrowding, limited lighting, economic hardship, and constant population movement created conditions in which crimes could occur with fewer witnesses and greater difficulty in tracing suspects. Investigators working within this context faced challenges that extended beyond the crimes themselves. Rooted in the realities of the community they were trying to protect. Understanding these conditions helps explain why authorities encountered obstacles during the investigation. The environment did not cause the events, but it influenced how they unfolded and how they were later examined. Whitechapel was a living neighborhood shaped by human struggle and resilience. And within its streets, the investigation that would become known as the Jack the Ripper case began to take form. By the year 1888, policing in London had undergone several decades of development, yet it remained very different from modern law enforcement systems. The Metropolitan Police Service, established in 1829, was responsible for maintaining order across most of the city, including the East End districts such as Whitechapel. Alongside it operated the City of London Police, a separate force with jurisdiction over the historic financial district. While cooperation between the two organizations existed, their boundaries sometimes created coordination challenges when investigations crossed geographic lines. Police officers, often referred to as constables, primarily worked on foot patrol. Each officer was assigned a specific route, known as a beat, which they walked repeatedly throughout their shift. The goal was visibility and deterrence rather than rapid response. Communication between officers relied largely on whistles, runners, or fixed call points, meaning that immediate coordination during incidents was limited compared with modern radio systems. Detective work was still evolving as a professional discipline. The Metropolitan Police had established a detective branch, later known as the Criminal Investigation Department, but investigative methods were constrained by the scientific knowledge of the time. Fingerprinting was not yet in routine use, and forensic techniques such as blood analysis or DNA identification did not exist. Investigators depended heavily on witness testimony, confessions, and physical observation of crime scenes. Crime scene preservation itself was less formalized than it would become in later years. Areas were examined by officers and medical personnel, but standardized procedures for protecting evidence were still developing. Crowds often gathered quickly when incidents occurred, sometimes contaminating locations before investigators arrived. Environmental factors, particularly in outdoor settings, further complicated the ability to interpret physical clues. Record-keeping was conducted through handwritten reports and ledgers. While these documents could be detailed, the absence of centralized databases meant that connecting cases relied on manual comparison and memory. Detectives reviewed statements, timelines, and descriptions carefully, but the process was slower and more labor-intensive than contemporary systems allow. Policing also involved navigating public perception. Communities sometimes viewed officers with suspicion, especially in areas experiencing poverty and social tension. Cooperation from witnesses could be inconsistent, either due to mistrust or fear of involvement. Language barriers within immigrant populations added another layer of difficulty, requiring officers to interpret statements across cultural differences. Medical knowledge contributed to investigations, but forensic pathology was still developing. Doctors examined injuries and attempted to estimate timing, yet precise conclusions were often limited by the tools available. Collaboration between police and medical professionals existed, though it did not yet operate under the structured forensic frameworks used today. Administrative leadership played an important role as well. Senior officers were responsible for allocating resources, organizing patrol patterns, and coordinating investigative efforts across districts. Decisions had to be made with limited information and under significant public scrutiny, particularly when crimes attracted widespread attention through newspapers. Despite these limitations, the police forces of 19th century London were considered advanced for their time. The concept of organized civilian policing itself was relatively modern, and many practices introduced in London influenced law enforcement systems in other countries. Officers were trained, uniforms were standardized, and institutional structures were in place to support investigations, even if scientific methods had not yet caught up with investigative needs. Understanding the capabilities and constraints of policing during this period is essential when examining the investigation that followed. Officers worked within a framework shaped by foot patrols, witness accounts, and observational reasoning. Their efforts were genuine, but the tools available to them placed natural limits on what could be discovered or proven. This context helps explain why certain questions remained unanswered, and why investigators sometimes relied on inference rather than conclusive evidence. The police were not operating without structure or intention. They were working within the boundaries of knowledge and technology that existed at the time. Boundaries that would soon be tested by a series of crimes that demanded answers beyond what the era could easily provide. In the months leading up to the crimes that would later be grouped together under a single name, police in Whitechapel were already responding to incidents of violence within the district. Assaults, robberies, and disputes were not uncommon in an area facing poverty and instability, and officers were accustomed to investigating cases that occurred during late-night hours in poorly lit streets. At first, the incidents that would later attract greater attention did not immediately appear connected to one another. One early case that later became part of investigative discussion involved a woman named Emma Smith, who was assaulted in April 1888 and later died from her injuries. Authorities initially treated this as an attack carried out by multiple assailants rather than an isolated individual. Because of that interpretation, the case was not formally connected to later crimes at the time, although some investigators and historians would later revisit its relevance. Another incident occurred in early August 1888 involving Martha Tabram, who was found deceased in a stairwell in Whitechapel. Police examined the circumstances carefully and considered whether the attack might indicate a pattern. However, at that stage, there was insufficient evidence to link it definitively to other cases. Investigators focused on gathering witness accounts, reviewing local activity, and attempting to identify individuals who might have been present in the area during the relevant time period. It was only after later events unfolded that authorities began to recognize the possibility of a series. As additional cases occurred within a relatively short time frame and within the same geographic district, similarities in circumstances drew increasing attention. Police began comparing details more closely, examining whether common factors such as location, timing, and victim vulnerability might indicate a related pattern of behavior. Public awareness also began to grow during this period. Newspapers reported on incidents occurring in the East End, sometimes emphasizing the dangers faced by residents and the difficulties encountered by police. Media coverage was not always consistent in its accuracy, but it played a significant role in shaping public perception. As stories circulated, concern within the community increased, and authorities faced rising pressure to provide reassurance and results. For investigators, determining whether multiple incidents were connected required careful judgment. Without modern forensic tools, linking cases depended largely on observational similarities and witness testimony. Officers examined locations, interviewed residents, and attempted to establish timelines that could either support or weaken the possibility of a single offender. Community fear began to influence daily life in Whitechapel. Residents became more cautious during nighttime hours, and some individuals altered routines to reduce perceived risk. Patrol officers reported heightened anxiety among the population, which in turn affected how information was shared with authorities. While increased awareness sometimes encouraged witnesses to come forward, it could also lead to rumors and unverified reports that complicated investigative efforts. Police leadership responded by reviewing patrol arrangements and encouraging officers to remain attentive to suspicious activity. Detectives worked to gather as much information as possible from each incident, even when connections between cases were uncertain. This period marked the gradual transition from isolated investigations toward recognition that a broader pattern might exist. By late summer of 1888, the situation had shifted from routine policing challenges to a growing sense of urgency. Authorities could not yet confirm that a single individual was responsible, but the accumulation of incidents within the same district created concern that something unusual was occurring. This atmosphere of uncertainty set the stage for the investigation that would soon intensify as further events unfolded. The rising concern was therefore not sudden. It developed over time, shaped by repeated incidents, increasing media attention, and the awareness that patterns might be emerging within a community already facing difficult social conditions. As police investigations progressed during 1888, authorities began identifying a group of cases that appeared to share similarities in location, timing, and victim profile. Over time, 5 individuals came to be recognized by investigators and later historians as the most likely victims, connected to a single offender. These cases are often referred to collectively as the canonical victims, not because absolute certainty exists, but because the available evidence shows enough consistency to suggest a related pattern. The first of these victims was Mary Ann Nichols, whose body was discovered in the early morning hours of August 31st, 1888, in Bucks Row in Whitechapel. Witness accounts indicated that she had been seen alive not long before the discovery, allowing investigators to narrow the estimated time of the incident. Police examined the location, recorded statements from individuals in the area, and began searching for any person who might have been present during the relevant time frame. Only a short time later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a residence on Hanbury Street. As with the earlier case, investigators worked to establish the timeline through witness testimony, environmental observation, and medical examination. The proximity in time and location between these two cases increased concern that a pattern might be emerging. The third case occurred on September 30th and involved Elizabeth Stride, whose body was discovered in Dutfield's yard. On the same night, Catherine Edos was found in Mitre Square, within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police rather than the Metropolitan Police. The occurrence of 2 incidents within a short period heightened urgency among authorities and required coordination between the 2 police forces. Investigators compared evidence, examined timelines, and attempted to determine whether the same individual could have been responsible for both cases. The final canonical victim was Mary Jane Kelly, discovered on November 9th in a room on Miller's Court. Unlike earlier incidents that occurred outdoors, this case took place within an indoor setting, presenting investigators with different environmental conditions and additional physical evidence to examine. The discovery marked the last of the widely recognized cases connected to the series during that year. From an investigative perspective, establishing the confirmed timeline depended heavily on witness observations. Individuals who reported seeing the victims shortly before their deaths provided critical reference points. Police attempted to verify these accounts by comparing them with known movements, lighting conditions, and other testimony. Medical examiners contributed by estimating time of death based on available knowledge, although precision was limited by the scientific tools of the period. Geographically, the incidents occurred within a relatively compact area of East London, primarily within Whitechapel and its immediate surroundings. This concentration allowed investigators to focus patrols and inquiries within a defined region, though the dense population and complex street layouts still created significant challenges. The timeline suggested that the offences occurred during late night or early morning hours, periods when streets were less crowded and lighting conditions reduced visibility. This pattern influenced police strategy, leading to increased patrol activity during nighttime shifts and efforts to monitor areas considered vulnerable. It is important to note that authorities at the time did not immediately classify all 5 cases as definitively connected. Investigators examined each incident individually while considering possible links. Over time, similarities in victim vulnerability, location, and circumstances led many officials to believe that a single offender might be responsible, though definitive proof was never established. The confirmed timeline, therefore, represents the best reconstruction available based on historical records. It outlines when and where each victim was discovered and the sequence in which the events unfolded. What remains uncertain is the exact movement of the offender between incidents, as well as whether additional cases outside the canonical group might also be connected. For investigators working in 1888, the emerging pattern created both clarity and pressure. Clarity came from recognizing similarities that might guide the search. Pressure came from public fear and media attention, which intensified as the timeline developed. Authorities faced the difficult task of pursuing leads within the limitations of their methods, while attempting to prevent further incidents. The canonical timeline would later become central to historical analysis of the case. It provides the framework through which the investigation is understood, even though the absence of a confirmed suspect leaves many questions unanswered. The investigation of the Whitechapel crimes was shaped heavily by the conditions of the crime scenes themselves and by the scientific limitations of the late 19th century. Most of the incidents occurred outdoors, in narrow streets, courtyards, or small enclosed spaces within a densely populated district. These environments presented immediate challenges for investigators attempting to preserve evidence and reconstruct events. When a crime was discovered, local residents or passers-by often alerted police quickly. Officers arriving at the scene were responsible for both securing the area and conducting initial observations. However, formal crime scene preservation procedures were still developing. Crowds sometimes gathered before officers could fully control access, and environmental factors such as weather, foot traffic, and lighting conditions could alter physical evidence before documentation was complete. Lighting was a significant limitation. Many streets were illuminated only by gas lamps placed at intervals, leaving sections in relative darkness. Investigators relied on lanterns or available light sources to examine locations, particularly during early morning hours when several incidents were discovered. Limited visibility affected the ability to identify small details and accurately record positions of objects or marks. Forensic science, as understood today, did not yet exist. There was no fingerprint identification system in routine use, no blood typing, and no ability to analyze biological material beyond basic visual assessment. Medical examiners could evaluate injuries and estimate approximate timing based on body temperature and environmental conditions, but precision was limited. Conclusions often depended on professional judgment rather than measurable laboratory analysis. Investigators focused primarily on observable physical evidence. This included clothing condition, positioning of the body, surrounding objects, and any items believed to have been left behind by the offender. Officers also examined ground surfaces for footprints or disturbances, though urban terrain made this difficult. Cobblestone streets, mud, and heavy foot traffic could obscure impressions quickly, reducing the chance of identifying usable tracks. Witness testimony, therefore, became one of the most important investigative tools. Detectives interviewed individuals who reported seeing the victims or suspicious persons in the area. Statements were compared for consistency, and timelines were constructed based on recollections of movement and sound. While valuable, this approach depended on memory, perception, and honesty, all of which introduced potential uncertainty. Medical examination contributed additional information. Doctors attempted to determine cause of death and estimate the time interval between death and discovery. They also assessed whether injuries suggested specific types of instruments or actions. However, without modern forensic testing, these interpretations could not always be confirmed with certainty. Documentation methods reflected the practices of the era. Officers recorded observations in notebooks and reports, sometimes supplemented by sketches or photographs when equipment was available. Photography was becoming more common in investigative work, but it required preparation and exposure time, limiting its use in low-light outdoor settings. As a result, written descriptions remained the primary record of many scenes. Another important limitation involved communication between investigative teams. Information was shared through written correspondence, meetings, and messenger delivery rather than instantaneous systems. This meant that comparisons between incidents could take longer, and coordination across jurisdictions required deliberate effort. Despite these constraints, investigators applied systematic reasoning to the evidence available. They examined similarities between cases, noted patterns in location and timing, and considered behavioral factors that might indicate a single offender. Their work demonstrated careful attention within the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. The forensic limitations of the era did not prevent investigation, but they shaped its outcomes. Without modern tools, authorities could identify patterns and develop theories. Yet they could not confirm those theories with the level of certainty expected today. Physical evidence that might now provide decisive identifications simply could not be analyzed in the 19th century. Understanding these limitations is essential when examining the historical case. Investigators were not ignoring evidence or failing to act. They were working with the methods and resources available at the time. The crime scenes provided clues, but the ability to interpret those clues remained constrained by technology and environmental conditions. These factors would continue to influence the investigation as public attention intensified and authorities sought ways to identify an offender within a rapidly changing and highly visible urban environment. As the series of crimes in Whitechapel continued through the late summer and autumn of 1888, public concern grew rapidly across London. Fear was not limited to the immediate neighbourhood. Newspaper reporting carried details of the incidents far beyond the East End, reaching readers throughout the city and across the country. The combination of repeated violence and uncertainty about the offender's identity created an atmosphere of anxiety that affected both residents and authorities. The press played a significant role in shaping public perception. Newspapers competed for readership, and detailed reporting on the Whitechapel crimes attracted widespread attention. Journalists described the investigative efforts, interviewed local residents, and sometimes speculated about possible motives or suspects. While some reporting aimed to inform, other coverage emphasized dramatic elements that increased public alarm. Police officials occasionally expressed concern that sensational reporting could interfere with the investigation by spreading rumors or encouraging false leads. Media coverage also influenced how the public interacted with authorities. Citizens began sending letters to police stations, offering information, theories, or warnings. Some writers believed they had seen suspicious individuals. Others suggested explanations based on personal interpretation of events. Each communication required assessment by investigators, adding to the administrative workload during an already demanding inquiry. Among these communications were letters claiming to be written by the offender. One of the most widely discussed examples was addressed to the Central News Agency and later forwarded to police. The writer used language that suggested responsibility for the crimes and used the name that would become associated with the case. Investigators examined such letters carefully, but determining authenticity proved extremely difficult. Without handwriting analysis, methods capable of definitive identification, authorities could not confirm whether any message truly originated from the offender. The volume of correspondence increased significantly after media outlets published excerpts of these letters. Public fascination with the case encouraged individuals to contribute their own communications, sometimes with genuine concern and sometimes for attention. Detectives had to evaluate each submission to determine whether it contained verifiable information. In most cases, letters did not provide evidence that could advance the investigation. Public fear also affected daily life in Whitechapel. Residents reported increased caution during nighttime hours, and some individuals chose to travel in groups rather than alone. Community meetings and discussions reflected concern about safety and the effectiveness of police protection. Authorities responded by increasing patrol presence and encouraging vigilance, though they could not provide complete reassurance while the offender remained unidentified. The relationship between police and the media became increasingly complex. On one hand, newspapers could help distribute official appeals for information and warnings to the public. On the other, inaccurate or speculative reporting could create confusion and distract investigators. Police leadership attempted to manage this balance by releasing limited confirmed information, while avoiding disclosure of details that might compromise the inquiry. Political attention also emerged as the case gained prominence. Government officials faced questions about public safety and policing resources in the East End. Discussions about social conditions, poverty and law enforcement capability became part of the broader conversation surrounding the crimes. The investigation was no longer only a police matter. It had become a public issue with social and political dimensions. From an investigative perspective, the flood of information created both opportunity and challenge. Increased awareness meant that more potential witnesses might come forward. At the same time, the sheer volume of tips and letters required careful filtering to identify anything credible. Detectives prioritized information that could be verified through independent means, such as physical description, location details, or corroborating testimony. The phenomenon of letters claiming authorship of the crimes would later become a defining feature of the historical case. Whether genuine or not, they contributed to the enduring public image associated with the investigation. However, investigators at the time treated them primarily as potential evidence to be assessed rather than as confirmed. Communications from the offender, public fear, media coverage, and correspondence therefore became intertwined elements of the investigative environment. They influenced how the case was perceived, how resources were allocated, and how authorities interacted with the community. The crimes themselves were the central concern, but the surrounding social response shaped the conditions under which investigators worked. This period marked a turning point in which the investigation moved from a local policing challenge to an event of national attention, placing additional pressure on officers attempting to identify an unknown offender within a complex and rapidly evolving public landscape. As the investigation progressed during 1888, police placed significant emphasis on witness accounts and the identification of potential suspects. Without modern forensic methods, testimony from individuals who had seen or interacted with the victims shortly before the crimes became one of the most valuable sources of information available to investigators. Detectives conducted extensive interviews with residents, workers and passers-by who had been present in the areas where the incidents occurred. Witness statements varied in detail and reliability. Some individuals reported seeing the victims speaking with men shortly before their deaths, while others described unfamiliar persons moving through the neighborhood during late-night hours. Investigators compared these accounts carefully, looking for similarities in physical description, behavior, or location that might indicate the same individual appearing across multiple incidents. However, inconsistencies between statements were common, reflecting the limitations of human memory and perception, especially under low lighting conditions. Police also considered the social environment when evaluating witness testimony. In districts like Whitechapel, residents might hesitate to become involved in investigations due to fear of retaliation or mistrust of authorities. Language barriers within immigrant communities could further complicate communication, requiring interpretation and increasing the risk of misunderstanding. Detectives therefore had to balance reliance on testimony with caution about its accuracy. From these interviews, investigators began identifying persons of interest. These were individuals whose behavior, presence in the area, or personal circumstances warranted further examination. Being considered a suspect did not imply guilt. It meant that detectives believed additional inquiry was justified based on available information. Authorities reviewed alibis, employment records, and movements, attempting to confirm whether individuals could reasonably have been connected to the crimes. In some cases, suspects were identified because they had prior criminal histories or were known to frequent areas where the incidents occurred. Others came to police attention through witness reports describing suspicious behavior. Investigators also examined whether any individuals possessed medical or anatomical knowledge that might relate to the nature of injuries observed by doctors, although such considerations remained speculative without supporting evidence. The investigative direction during this period was broad rather than focused on a single individual. Detectives pursued multiple lines of inquiry simultaneously, recognizing that narrowing attention too quickly could cause important information to be overlooked. Lists of potential suspects expanded and contracted as new information emerged or existing leads were disproven. Many individuals initially considered relevant were later eliminated after alibis or inconsistencies were confirmed. Police leadership faced the challenge of allocating limited resources across numerous possibilities. Officers conducted surveillance, interviews, and background checks where feasible, but the absence of definitive physical evidence meant that most inquiries relied on circumstantial factors. Without fingerprints, reliable forensic analysis, or comprehensive identification records, confirming a suspect's involvement was extremely difficult, unless a confession or direct witness identification could be obtained. Public pressure influenced investigative direction as well. Newspapers frequently speculated about potential suspects, sometimes naming individuals without evidence. Such reporting could complicate police work by spreading misinformation or prompting false accusations within the community. Authorities attempted to manage these effects by maintaining confidentiality around active inquiries whenever possible. Another factor shaping early investigative strategy was the geographic concentration of the crimes. Because incidents occurred within a relatively limited area, detectives considered the possibility that the offender lived or worked nearby. This led to door-to-door inquiries, examination of lodging houses, and interviews with individuals whose occupations involved nighttime movement, such as laborers, market workers, and transportation employees. Despite these efforts, no suspect could be linked conclusively to the crimes. Each potential lead encountered limitations, whether through lack of corroboration, conflicting testimony, or insufficient evidence. Investigators continued to gather information, hoping that additional incidents or witness reports might clarify patterns that would narrow the field. The early investigative direction therefore remained characterized by uncertainty. Police were actively pursuing multiple possibilities, guided by witness accounts and logical inference, but constrained by the investigative tools available at the time. The absence of definitive evidence did not reflect inactivity. It reflected the inherent difficulty of identifying an unknown offender within a crowded urban environment using 19th century methods. This period established the foundation for later investigative efforts. Witness testimony, suspect lists, and geographic analysis would continue to influence police strategy as authorities sought to prevent further crimes and bring clarity to a case that was rapidly becoming one of the most challenging in London's history. As concern grew and public attention intensified during the Whitechapel investigation, police leadership adjusted operational strategies in an effort to prevent further crimes and identify the offender. The primary tool available to authorities was increased physical presence. Officers were assigned additional patrol duties, particularly during nighttime hours when the incidents had occurred. Foot patrols were extended, and constables were instructed to remain alert to suspicious behavior or individuals moving through poorly lit areas. Despite these efforts, the structure of policing in 19th century London created unavoidable limitations. Officers could only cover a finite distance within a given period, and even with increased numbers, large portions of the district remained temporarily unobserved between patrol passes. Whitechapel's dense network of streets, alleys, and courtyards provided numerous routes through which an individual could move without detection. The geography of the neighborhood therefore reduced the effectiveness of patrol-based prevention strategies. Police also attempted to coordinate more closely with local residents and business owners. Officers encouraged community members to report unusual activity and to remain vigilant during late hours. Lodging house operators were asked to monitor guests and share information if suspicious behavior was observed. These measures reflected a collaborative approach, recognizing that community awareness could supplement limited police coverage. Detectives considered whether targeted surveillance might identify individuals connected to the crimes. Known offenders, persons previously questioned, and individuals whose behavior raised concern were observed where resources allowed. However, surveillance techniques were basic compared with modern standards. Continuous observation required significant manpower, and maintaining discretion in crowded urban areas was difficult. As a result, sustained monitoring could only be applied selectively. Operational challenges also arose from communication limitations. Officers relied on whistles, runners, or designated call points to request assistance or share information. Without instantaneous communication systems, coordination between patrol units depended heavily on planning rather than real-time response. If an incident occurred between patrol passes, the delay before officers became aware could be significant. The presence of two separate police forces within adjacent jurisdictions introduced additional complexity. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police maintained their own command structures, resources, and administrative procedures. When crimes occurred near jurisdictional boundaries, coordination required deliberate cooperation between agencies. Although information was shared, differences in authority sometimes complicated operational planning. Environmental conditions within Whitechapel added further obstacles. Nighttime lighting remained inconsistent, and weather conditions such as fog could reduce visibility dramatically. Noise from urban activity could mask sounds that might otherwise attract attention. These factors limited the ability of officers to detect incidents in progress, even when patrol presence was increased. Public pressure influenced operational decisions as well. Authorities faced expectations that visible action would reassure residents and demonstrate progress. Increased patrol numbers served both practical and symbolic purposes, showing that police were responding actively to the situation. However, visibility alone could not guarantee prevention, particularly when the offender's movements were unpredictable. Investigators also explored whether behavioral patterns could guide deployment. By analyzing locations and timing of previous incidents, officers attempted to anticipate where risk might be highest. Patrol routes were adjusted accordingly, though the limited number of incidents made precise prediction difficult. the strategy relied on probability rather than certainty. Despite the operational adjustments, the crimes continued to challenge police effectiveness. The offender appeared able to act within narrow time windows and disappear into the surrounding environment before detection. This pattern highlighted the limitations of patrol-based policing when confronted with an unknown individual operating opportunistically within a crowded urban setting. The operational challenges faced by police during this period were therefore not solely the result of inadequate effort. They were shaped by the realities of 19th century urban policing, including limited technology, communication constraints, and environmental complexity. Officers worked within these boundaries, attempting to adapt strategies as new information emerged. This phase of the investigation demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the policing system of the era. Increased patrols, community engagement, and targeted observation represented logical responses to the situation. Yet the absence of modern investigative tools meant that identifying and apprehending the offender required evidence that the environment and circumstances did not easily provide. As the investigation continued, these operational realities would remain central to understanding why the case proved so difficult to resolve, even as authorities devoted significant attention and resources to the effort. One of the less visible but important factors influencing the investigation was the relationship between the two police forces operating in central London at the time. The majority of Whitechapel fell under the authority of the Metropolitan Police, while nearby areas, including parts of the financial district, were the responsibility of the City of London Police. Each organisation maintained its own leadership structure, investigative personnel, and administrative procedures. Although cooperation existed, the presence of separate jurisdictions created challenges when incidents crossed boundaries or required shared information. This situation became particularly relevant after the events of September 30th, 1888, when two crimes occurred within a short period, one within Metropolitan Police territory and the other within City of London jurisdiction. Investigators from both forces needed to exchange information quickly to determine whether the incidents were connected and whether the same individual could be responsible. Coordination was achieved through meetings and communication between senior officers, but the process lacked the unified command structure that might exist in a single-agency investigation. Differences in investigative approach and organizational culture also contributed to tension. Leadership within each force was accountable to its own administrative hierarchy and public expectations. Decisions about resource allocation, communication with the press, and investigative priorities could therefore vary. While both organizations shared the goal of identifying the offender, maintaining institutional independence sometimes complicated collaborative efforts. Public scrutiny increased pressure on both forces. Newspapers reported not only on the crimes themselves, but also on perceived disagreements between officials. Media commentary occasionally portrayed coordination difficulties as evidence of institutional rivalry, which in turn influenced public perception of the investigation. Police leadership had to balance the need for cooperation with the desire to maintain professional credibility within their respective organizations. Administrative communication methods further complicated coordination. Information sharing relied on written correspondence, scheduled meetings, and messenger delivery rather than instantaneous systems. Delays could occur simply due to the time required to transmit documents or arrange discussions between departments. In fast-moving investigations, these delays could affect the speed at which decisions were made. Jurisdictional boundaries also affected operational authority. Officers from one force could not automatically exercise powers within the territory of the other without appropriate arrangements. This meant that surveillance, questioning, or evidence collection sometimes required additional procedural steps when investigations extended across boundaries. While such processes were manageable, they added complexity during a period when rapid action was often desired. Internal disagreements were not limited to jurisdiction alone. Within each organization, investigators and administrators sometimes held differing views about investigative direction. Questions about suspect credibility, patrol strategy, and communication with the public could generate debate. Such discussions are common in complex investigations, but when combined with external pressure, they could contribute to perceptions of disunity. Despite these challenges, cooperation between the forces did occur. Officers shared information, compared evidence, and consulted with one another when necessary. Joint efforts were particularly evident when examining the possibility that multiple incidents were connected. However, the structural separation remained a factor that investigators had to navigate throughout the case. From a historical perspective, the jurisdictional situation illustrates how institutional design can influence investigative effectiveness. The presence of two independent forces within close geographic proximity required coordination mechanisms that were still evolving. Modern policing systems often address such issues through unified command structures or formal interagency agreements. But in 1888, these arrangements were less developed. The tension that arose was therefore not purely interpersonal. It reflected organizational realities shaped by legal authority, administrative independence, and public accountability. Officers on both sides were attempting to manage a complex investigation within frameworks that had inherent limitations. Understanding these institutional dynamics helps explain some of the difficulties encountered during the case. Challenges were not only technical or environmental, they also involved the coordination of human organizations operating under separate mandates. This added another layer of complexity to an investigation that was already demanding due to the nature of the crimes and the limitations of the era. By the late autumn of 1888, the series of crimes that had drawn intense attention across London appeared to come to an end. After the death of Mary Jane Kelly in November, no further incidents occurred that investigators could confidently link to the same offender. Police continued patrols and investigative efforts for some time, but the pattern that had created widespread fear gradually subsided. The absence of additional cases presented both relief and uncertainty for authorities. On one hand, the immediate threat to the community appeared to have diminished. On the other, the lack of new evidence made it more difficult to identify a suspect. Without further incidents to compare or additional witness accounts, investigators had limited opportunities to develop new leads. The investigation therefore shifted from active pursuit toward review and analysis of the information already gathered. Detectives revisited witness statements, suspect interviews, and timelines, searching for overlooked details that might clarify the offender's identity. Individuals previously considered suspects were reassessed as new information emerged or as alibis were strengthened. Despite these efforts, no person could be linked conclusively to the crimes through evidence available at the time. Administrative leadership faced the challenge of determining how long to maintain intensive investigative activity. Resources had to be balanced across other policing priorities within the city. While the case remained important, practical considerations required gradual reallocation of personnel. Patrol levels in Whitechapel eventually returned closer to normal patterns as immediate public fear decreased. The investigation was never formally solved or closed in the modern sense. Instead, it transitioned into a state where no active suspect had been identified and no new evidence was available to pursue. Reports and records were archived, and the case remained part of institutional memory rather than an ongoing operational priority. Authorities acknowledged that the offender had not been identified, but without additional information, there was little further action they could take. Public attention, however, did not disappear entirely. Newspapers continued discussing possible suspects and theories, sometimes years after the events. Speculation persisted, in part because the crimes had never been conclusively resolved. The absence of an identified offender left space for interpretation, debate, and continuing curiosity within both the public and professional communities. For police officers involved in the investigation, the lack of resolution represented a difficult outcome. Investigators had devoted substantial effort within the limits of their tools and knowledge. Yet the available evidence did not allow them to reach a definitive conclusion. Cases that remain unresolved often reflect not a lack of commitment, but the reality that certain information may never become available. The decline of the crimes themselves remains one of the enduring uncertainties. Whether the offender ceased activity voluntarily, relocated, was prevented by circumstance, or died is unknown. Investigators could only document that the pattern ended after November 1888. Without further incidents, determining the reason for the cessation was not possible. From an institutional perspective, the case illustrates how investigations can transition from active inquiry to historical record when evidence is insufficient for resolution. Authorities maintained documentation, preserved reports, and allowed for the possibility that new information might emerge in the future. However, without additional leads, practical investigative activity diminished over time. The end of the immediate threat brought some relief to the Whitechapel community, though memories of fear lingered. Residents gradually returned to daily routines, and the intense focus on nighttime safety decreased. The events remained part of local history, influencing perceptions of policing and urban life for years afterward. The case closure, without resolution therefore, reflects both the limitations of the era and the complexity of the circumstances. Investigators reached the boundary of what could be determined using available methods. Beyond that point, uncertainty remained, and the case entered history as an unresolved investigation that would continue to attract attention long after the events themselves had passed. In the decades following the events of 1888, the Whitechapel investigation gradually moved from an active police matter into the realm of historical analysis. Official records, reports, and witness statements remained preserved within institutional archives, allowing later generations to examine the case with new perspectives. As policing methods and forensic science advanced, interest in revisiting the investigation continued, both within professional circles and among historians. Later, police officials occasionally reviewed the original documentation, comparing historical evidence with modern investigative understanding. These reviews did not involve new physical evidence, since most material from the time had either deteriorated or was no longer available for scientific testing. Instead, the focus was on reassessing timelines, witness credibility, and investigative decisions using contemporary reasoning. Such efforts sometimes clarified misunderstandings, but did not produce definitive identification of an offender. Historical researchers also contributed to analysis by examining social context, institutional records, and newspaper archives. Their work helped reconstruct aspects of daily life in Whitechapel and the operational challenges faced by police. By placing the investigation within its broader historical environment, researchers gained insight into why certain leads were pursued and why others remained unresolved. This approach emphasized understanding rather than solving the case. Continuing questions have persisted largely because the available evidence does not allow firm conclusions. Witness descriptions varied, suspect information was incomplete, and forensic limitations prevented conclusive identification. These uncertainties leave space for multiple interpretations, but none have achieved universal acceptance. Professional investigators generally maintain that without new verifiable evidence, the case cannot be resolved definitively. Public fascination has played a role in sustaining attention over time. Books, articles, and documentaries have explored possible suspects and theories, sometimes presenting new interpretations of historical material. While such work can contribute to understanding, it also introduces speculation that must be separated from confirmed facts. Distinguishing between documented evidence and later interpretation remains essential when evaluating claims about the case. Modern forensic science has occasionally been discussed in relation to historical investigations, including this one. Advances such as DNA analysis have solved many previously unresolved cases from the 20th century. However, applying such methods to 19th century evidence is often impractical due to the absence of preserved biological material or the risk of contamination over time. As a result, technological progress alone has not provided answers for this particular investigation. The continuing questions surrounding the case, therefore, reflect both historical distance and evidentiary limitation. Some aspects, such as the sequence of events and geographic concentration, are well established. Others, including the identity and motive of the offender, remain uncertain. This combination of known and unknown elements contributes to the enduring interest in the investigation. For historians and investigators alike, the case serves as an example of how certain events resist resolution despite sustained attention. It illustrates the importance of context, the influence of technological limitations, and the challenges of reconstructing events long after they occur. The absence of certainty does not diminish the historical significance of the investigation. Instead, it highlights the complexity of urban life, policing, and human behavior within a particular moment in time. As years have passed, the Whitechapel crimes have become part of London's historical memory. Streets have changed, communities have evolved, and policing methods have advanced considerably. Yet the investigation remains a reference point in discussions about criminal history and investigative development. The continuing questions are not merely curiosities. They are reminders of how knowledge is shaped by the tools available, and how some mysteries remain open within the historical record. As this story settles into the quiet of the night, what remains most noticeable is not only the uncertainty, but the passage of time itself. The streets of Whitechapel have changed many times since 1888. Buildings have been rebuilt, communities have evolved, and generations have lived their lives in places where investigators once searched for answers under gaslight and shadow. History moves forward, yet certain moments remain preserved within collective memory. The investigation into the Whitechapel crimes reflects a period when policing, science, and urban life were all still developing. Officers worked with the knowledge available to them, facing challenges that would be difficult even with modern tools. Their efforts were shaped by the environment, by institutional limitations, and by the human realities of a crowded city. The absence of resolution does not erase that effort. Instead, it reminds us that some investigations reach a point where certainty cannot be achieved. There is also something quiet about the way unresolved events remain present across time. Questions that were asked more than a century ago still exist today, not because they were ignored, but because evidence does not always provide clear conclusions. In this way, uncertainty becomes part of history itself, carried forward alongside the facts that are known. Tonight, there is no need to search for answers that have not appeared for generations. Instead, the story can rest where it belongs, within the past. The lives that intersected with this investigation were real, shaped by circumstances of their era, and the city around them has continued to move forward. As you rest, you can allow the details to soften and the atmosphere to quiet. The sounds of modern life are far removed from the streets that investigators once walked, and the distance of time provides space for reflection rather than tension. Some stories remain open, and that openness does not disturb the calm. It simply becomes part of the landscape of memory. The night deepens, London grows still, and the investigation that once filled newspapers and patrol routes now settles gently into history, where curiosity can exist alongside acceptance, and where the quiet of the present moment remains undisturbed.